2219, that's the count in favor of the People's National Movement. If you are just waking up, I know some people went to bed early and probably now getting the results this morning. And in his speech yesterday evening, Dr. Rowley said the next 2 years will be difficult, but if we pull together, we can reap the benefits beyond the 2 years. And that speaks to the economy and the management of the economy. And we have on the line Dr. Marlene Attzs, a UE-based economist. Good morning, Dr. Attzs.
Hi, good morning, Lisa.
Oh, thank you so much. You have been working assiduously over the period. I know up until even last evening you were working, so we really do appreciate that you are coming on this morning with us. What do you make of the results, Dr. Attzs?
Well, I think it was always, certainly for me, I'm not a political analyst, but as a Trinbagonian, looking on at what was happening and listening to some of the narratives coming out from the various political parties, it was my view that it was going to be a close race, and I think so said, so done. I think it was down to the wire. It was a fairly nail-biting experience, and yesterday actually was the first time that I had to stay awake throughout the entire elections process and for the results coming in, because I was doing some similar commentary as what I'm doing this morning from the economic perspective. So I actually was awake throughout all of it. Otherwise, I would have been fast asleep and I would have woken up to the news this morning.
Yes.
So
let's jump right in with regard to the economy. Dr. Keith Rowley indicated that the next 2 years will be difficult. What are you saying to this? And especially as we are in the middle of a pandemic and we know what COVID-19 has done to not just Trinidad and Tobago, but the global economy. What are your predictions?
Well, the reality is that we have had some challenges. We in Trinidad and Tobago have had some challenges, certainly becoming more and more manifested, I would say, close to a year now, as given our heavy dependence on oil and gas and the vacillations that have been taking place in the global oil and gas market. Trinidad and Tobago, since that is our primary source of revenue, we have been feeling the pinch, and certainly all commodity-based economies, so some of the other Caribbean countries that are also commodity-based, so your Guyana, for example, even though Guyana is enjoying its newfound wealth from the energy sector, I think we've been taking a hit because of what is going on with the global prices. Now, this has been exacerbated by COVID-19, and I think the country is aware that when COVID-19, literally on Ash Wednesday, we were faced with the stark reality that COVID-19 was knocking at our door, and we needed to respond. And the government did respond by essentially closing down the country and isolating us from the rest of the world, essentially to prevent the spread of the virus. And while many people may not have appreciated it, and I don't mean that to be a negative comment, they may not have appreciated it because they would have felt the impact directly. Yes. So people who work in some sectors, so if you work in bars, if you work in the tourism industry, you would have felt that impact in a very, very real way, because you would have found yourself out of a job since March or April of this year. But to their credit, the government tried to soften the blow from closing down the economy by putting different, what we call fiscal and monetary measures in place. So there were adjustments to interest rates. The banks were asked to essentially hold their hand in terms of mortgage payments, et cetera, et cetera. Which for a bank, when your business is making money and someone asks you kindly to hold your hand and don't collect millions of dollars from your customers, so we all got into the COVID-19 response in a very collective, real way, and I think people need to understand what has happened over the past few months in Trinidad and Tobago. We have had a series of impacts from COVID-19, the primary impact being, of course, on the health sector in terms of the additional expenditures that the government had to find and using funds from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund to deal with that, but also having to get some funds to provide support to some of the vulnerable members of our society, those persons, those self-employed persons, or persons who are the lower echelons of the society who would have lost their jobs because their bars or whatever it is, or the tourism, the hotels that have had to close. So government finding some way to support those persons, but at the same time trying to maintain the spread. So it has been an unenviable job that the government has had to do since March. And then, of course, the fallout from the education system, which is something that continues to trouble me because, I was asked recently what would happen when we started having the clustering of COVID cases. And, someone called me to ask me, what were my thoughts, how it would impact on the economy. And, my response was, we already know what the economic impact would be in terms of the closures and how it will affect businesses and persons and unemployment and all of those things are serious issues that we would need to grapple with.
Yes.
But we keep forgetting that schools, we talk about, the future is in your school bag, the famous words from Prime Minister Eric Williams, etc. But when we disrupt schools and some children have not had any exposure to learning since March, and that is a serious consequence of COVID-19. So, it's a mouthful that I'm putting out there this morning, but simply to say that the impact of COVID-19 and the economic and the social and economic impact of COVID-19 there's several layers to it, and the government is really going to be challenged, separate and apart from the dollars and cents aspect of it, from the financial aspect of it. Now, the government is going to be challenged.
Now, with regard to a pandemic, this would be unprecedented grounds, at least since 1918, for example, with the Spanish flu. What measures, therefore, are in place or can the government put in place to ensure stimulation of the economy as they move forward?
Well, I think one of the first things that the government has to do is that it's going to have to reconcile its books, and I'm putting that very loosely, what we call fiscal and monetary consolidation. We're going to have to try to realign our economy in the context of lower oil and gas revenues. I think that is a very serious conversation that the Minister of Finance will have to look at in the coming days. Prime Minister-elect Rowley indicated last night that one of the immediate things the government has to look at is preparing for a budget. And I am cautious that the next budget is probably going to be a very real Trinidad and Tobago budget, and real in the sense that government is going to have to make some hard decisions, including how it's going to engage and embrace the private sector, for example, how it is going to provide catalysts for small and medium enterprises, because we're going to have to change the narrative around our economic space in terms of who the major actors are. So Prime Minister Rowley had the recovery team. There are all of those recommendations that have come out from the recovery team. But inside of those recommendations, you need to find a space where you can onboard the private sector, and when I say onboard the private sector, ensure that the institutional frameworks are in place to allow the private sector to meaningfully contribute to driving the economic space and contributing to economic growth, because the government can't do it alone. Government's revenue comes primarily from oil and gas, and that source is not giving you the kinds of revenue streams that you enjoyed in the past. So you have to look elsewhere. So there's going to have to be some onboarding and cajoling of the private sector in terms of getting the private sector more involved in the economic space. Some of the things that government would probably want to look seriously at, and they mentioned it in their manifesto, so we will see whether they will actually implement some of those measures, is the ease of doing business. Some of those bureaucratic systems that have plagued the private sector's more active involvement in the economic space. Government did commit, the PNM did commit in its manifesto to address some of those issues. Likewise, the small and medium enterprises. I think we're at an interesting time in our history where we can essentially do right by the SME sector. Globally, SMEs have been shown to contribute significantly to economies once the right systems are in place and once the SMEs are essentially, I mean, we talk about SMEs in Trinidad and Tobago, and I think for years we've been talking about them more along the lines of mom and pop shops. And while mom and pop shops are important, they are not going to give you the kind of economic stimulus that is required to contribute.
They need to be scalable, right? You're talking about scalable SMEs
precisely.
here.
Yeah. And ultimately, when you go more into the medium enterprises, you're talking about businesses that can contribute to foreign exchange earnings.
Yes.
So you want businesses that can actually help you earn foreign exchange, as opposed to simply businesses that supply local content for a small market. So we want things that can engage in export-oriented kinds of business and contribute to foreign exchange earning in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
And then there's also going to have to be the issue of how individuals, we're going to have to look at the financial sector problems that will arise, because COVID-19 has not left the building. COVID-19 is going to be with us for a long time, and many businesses, many firms, and many individuals may find it hard to meet their obligations over the next coming months, because some businesses would have actually closed, and permanently so, as a result of COVID-19. Some of them are still trying to get back on their feet, and with the resurgence of COVID, what possibly is being termed the second wave of COVID in Trinidad and Tobago, we're going to have to see whether or not we can actually support those individuals and those firms to help them navigate this new wave, and also to be sustainable moving forward.
Yes.
So government is going to have its hands full, and then inside of all of that, of course, there'll be social protection programs, because we still need to have those social protection programs. And while we have many programs on our books, possibly the time has come for us to consolidate those programs and to see how they can make more targeted and direct interventions for the most vulnerable in our society. So it is going to be a complex series of intersecting measures that will have to be put in place for the next coming months. And not a task that I envy the Minister of Finance, particularly since you have certainly less resources than you had in previous years.
Yeah, and Dr. Let's go back to the topic of inclusion of the private sector. Dr. Keith Rowley spoke about housing, for example, and involving the private sector with regard to housing, and because the state just cannot provide the amount of houses that are required to facilitate all the requests that are before the state right now.
Yes, I mean, definitely. Any economy moving forward is going to need to have an active private sector involvement, and our private sector has shown that they are up to the task, they're equal to the task. I mean, when the first lockdown came in March, April, and the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance were making their announcements, they were always very clear that they appreciated the support from the private sector in terms of the implementation of some of the measures that were being put in place to safeguard the country from COVID-19 and to ensure that there would be some business continuity. So the private sector held their hand in many regards and provided support to the government. So I think the willingness is there, and I think that has always been very clear. But government has recognized that there are some gaps, as it were, some constraints which need to be addressed if the private sector really is to get more seriously and more meaningfully involved in propelling the economy forward.
And Rokas is here with us, as well as Carrie, and Rokas is going to jump in, followed by Carrie.
Hi, morning, Dr.
Morning,
Dr. Attzs. I just wanted to know, you've been talking about us trying to find ways to basically generate income and stimulate the economy. I know that one of the things that we have unlimited amount of is human resource. And, I was wondering, how wise do you think it is to invest in, for example, a sector like the culture sector to be able to do that exportation that you were talking about? Because the one thing that we never run out of is... Pardon?
A sector like, I missed that. Culture, is it?
Culture, yeah.
Yes.
I was wondering, in terms of investing in a sector like culture, how important do you think that would, or how real or realistic is it for us to be able to try and export that to the amount of money that you're talking about that we need to, or is it that we need a bunch of different things to be able to fill the pot?
I think culture is absolutely essential, and unfortunately, I don't get the sense that we see it as a real economic prospect outside of Carnival, because that's what we export at Carnival time, even though the product is taking place in Trinidad. We're exporting it because people are actually coming into the country, spending foreign exchange. We're also spending some foreign exchange in terms of things like the costumes. But there is an opportunity for us to essentially harness that creative effort, harness that cultural product, and package it in a way that we can sell to the rest of the world. That is what Jamaica has successfully done, for example, with reggae music. That is what many of our artists are doing on an international stage. I was chatting with some friends over the weekend, and we were lamenting that from the artist's perspective, so it's the whole question of the culture and the creative aspect of it, the only carnival that survived 2020 was Trinidad Carnival. And, you were wondering what is the fate of many of the other artists and the other service providers who participate in that particular sector. And I think that's an interesting survey that someone may want to do to find out, well, what has been happening to these persons after March, because we're in August, so there would have been Grenada Carnival, there would be
Cropover,
Caribana, there would be Miami, Caribana,
Jamaica,
Labor Day, there are all of these things, none of which are going to happen, of course, not this year, and possibly not even next year. But I think certainly the thing about COVID-19, when it happened, of course, I was traumatized like the rest of the world. And then I realized that here is an opportunity for us. David Rudder sang, out of a muddy pond, 10,000 flowers bloom. Here is an opportunity for us to transform in a very serious way. We have no choice but to face COVID-19 and to navigate a space to do things differently. And creative industries, culture is one of those opportunities that is in front of us. We simply have to find a way to package it, to tweak the product in a way that can earn even more foreign exchange than it has been earning in the past, and to move forward from that. But we are at that juncture in our economic history in Trinidad and Tobago where the possibilities are endless. I like to be optimistic when we look at these things. So while there is COVID, while there are depressed oil and gas prices, there are also opportunities for us to become a lot more creative, no pun intended, in terms of how we navigate our social and economic affairs in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think the creative sector, as you actually said, and there are several aspects to creative and culture. So there is mass, there is music, there is our food, there are all sorts of things.
Yep.
You see people buying doubles or rotis for $6 and $10 and all of those things.
Yep.
That's part of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yep.
Yeah.
Dr. Attzs, good morning. Carrie here.
Hi, morning, Carrie.
I have two questions wrapped into one. So we always hear this word diversification of the economy and stuff. And, the question is, for a country that is so focused and so invested in oil, what is the degree of difficulty of like diversifying the economy into something else? That's the first part of the question. And would we have the funds available to, on a phased basis, shift the economy toward diversification?
All right. So, yes, diversification is one of those words that turns up at least once a day in somebody's lexicon. But I often talk about diversification in the context of transformation as well, because we've been talking diversification at least for 50 years, and we've not quite accomplished that because we've always had the fallback position of oil and gas. So they say God is a Trini, so whenever things get really, really bad, then the price of oil rebounds and we breathe a sigh of relief and we go back to being comfortable with the oil and gas sector being our primary driver in Trinidad and Tobago. That reality, the reality of our overdependence on oil and gas, I think, has hit home in a very real way this year, because we've had to deal with oil and gas for the first time, negative prices, meaning that people just simply did not want oil and gas, which means that a small country like Trinidad and Tobago, that is not a major game changer in the oil and gas sector, really felt the brunt of that fallout in the energy sector. So we have that as one pillar from which to move. The second issue is that I'm not saying that it's a magic wand in terms of economic diversification and transformation. We will continue to be dependent on the oil and gas sector for a while because we have to wean ourselves out of it. And when I'm saying that we have to wean ourselves off, because there's also a cultural shift that needs to go with that diversification and transformation. And I keep talking about the transformation side of it because I'm saying we can't simply articulate a conversation around, well, let me diversify or let me transform the economy. There are a whole number of systems, and I've been suggesting for some years now that our education system has to be central to that transformative process and that diversification process. So what are we going to diversify into? We need to have the human capital to support it. So our education system has to be training people to help support those industries. Prime Minister Elect Rowley, has been talking a lot within recent times about digitization of the economy following the Estonia model. That is not something that happens overnight. Our systems, including our education system, has to start to create that shift in the way in which we teach, in the way in which we learn. When COVID-19 happened, it showed how unprepared we were for online platforms. So the former Minister of Education, Minister Garcia, would have said that at least the ministries, and I imagine their conservative estimate was there were 60,000 students who did not have any access to online platforms when we shut down the traditional face-to-face teaching. And I'm saying all of these things to say that the economic diversification, transformation, conversation, yes, it is going to require resources to help transform, but there are also very clear sectors that we can transform into. We have a multi-billion-dollar food import sector. We've been talking about agriculture. Some people are still of the view that you need to have land for agriculture. Well, as far as I am aware, you can have some land, but you can also have some technology-based types of agriculture sector. It would make sense for us to look to diversify into the agriculture sector because it serves two purposes. Mm-hmm. One, it helps us reduce our food import bill. But also, two, it also helps create a viable sector for which there will be a ready market in terms of the local economy. All right? And it helps you, three, monitor things like food and nutrition security, because when we import food, we don't know what we're importing. When we grow food, and once we grow food sustainably, and we pay serious attention to it, we are almost certain, or certainly are in a better position to know what kind of food we're being what kind of food we're producing, and whether it's going to contribute to a more healthy healthier Trinidad and Tobago. So for me, yes, I hear the conversation around economic diversification and transformation, but I think that there are other layers to that conversation, including your human capital base. What is your education system going to look like to support this economic diversification transformation? I think therein lies part of the challenge, that we're not linking our education system to what we want those new sectors to look like.
Yeah, yeah. So it's very complex.
So it's very complex.
It's very complex.
And then the second part of it is that there's some early wins that we can look to. So the agriculture sector, manufacturing is also one of those things. We have a vibrant manufacturing sector. We simply need to put, as I was saying earlier in the conversation, we simply need to address some of the challenges that the manufacturing sector has been facing for years. VAT refunds, bureaucratic processes, inefficient processes, filings, inland revenue. All of those things that are well known, crime, all of those issues that are well known. But I think there is an opportunity now for us to, in the face of COVID at this juncture, the intersecting space between COVID and declining energy prices provides Trinidad and Tobago with a unique opportunity to essentially line up our ducks and say, all right, this is what we're going to commit ourselves to. And one of the things I would love to see the new administration is to set some targets. So in 2.5 years, this is what you want Trinidad and Tobago's economic landscape to look like from a GDP perspective. So agriculture must take on a greater significance in terms of contributing to the local economy, and also to employment. There are lots of ideas floating around in terms of how the agriculture sector can contribute to employment, how it can contribute to reducing the food import bill, all of these issues. So there are plans there. It's just to have the will behind it for us to make that, to essentially nudge the pendulum away from oil and gas and towards other sectors. So manufacturing and agriculture are two of the early wins, possible wins that we can have in terms of the conversation. But it just requires the will political will to begin nudging the pendulum, as it were, away from oil and gas. And I know that that oil and gas will be part of our lexicon and our narrative for years to come. But we have to face the realities out there.
And we're going to have to leave it right there, Dr. Marlene. So I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning. And, again, we could have chat with you for the rest of the morning, really. So
Definitely.
full of education and information there on the economy. And now we do have to take a break to go to the news at 7 o'clock, and we'll be back with the second half of the show after that. This is